Excellent. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome. How's the sound at the back? Good? Okay, fabulous. I haven't got my specs, so I'm going to have an interesting time with the introduction here. Welcome to you all. My name is Professor Frances Bowen, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Social Sciences here at UEA. It's my very great pleasure to be introducing Professor Laura Camfield to you this evening. After a first degree in history, Laura had the career-changing experience of working for the Aga Khan Rural Support Program in northern Pakistan in their monitoring and evaluation department. This convinced her, as similar experience shaped the choices of many of our international development students, that she wanted to work in international development. While in Pakistan, Laura had worked with an ex-social development specialist at the Department for International Development. So she decided to train for her future career by doing a part-time master's in the anthropology of development at SOAS in London. To support herself at that time, Laura worked as a research administrator in the Institute of Clinical Neurology on a study looking at the prevalence across Europe of dystonia. That's a neurological condition that causes uncontrolled muscle spasms. This would later become the focus of her own PhD research. In addition, Laura volunteered for the Female Prisoners Welfare Project, working with women from Latin America and the Caribbean who had been imprisoned for drug smuggling. Her dissertation was an impassioned critique of the prison system. Working in prisons, as well as growing up in South Wales during the miners' strike, focused Laura's attention on poverty and inequality in the UK. Combined with the robust post-colonial critique of development practice offered by SOAS, these experiences convinced her that any further study should be what was then called anthropology at home. Consequently, Laura applied to do her PhD at Goldsmiths, where there was a growing body of work on the anthropology of measurement, led by Chris Shaw. Having spent 4 years doing ethnography in the UK and in Europe more broadly, Laura was surprised to find herself back in the global south. She took a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Bath in the Wellbeing in Developing Countries Research Project, or WED. This was an ideal fit, since they were looking for someone who both knew how to develop quality of life measures and was critical of such measurements, to explore whether this would be a useful tool for development practice. After 5 years at Bath, Laura was headhunted by Oxford University for Young Lives, a longitudinal study of children's lives in the global south. Here she used her methodological experience to launch qualitative research to run alongside the quantitative survey. In both Young Lives and in WED, Laura's particular focus was how to mix methods in a rigorous and a credible way. She'll discuss this mixing in her lecture this evening. Laura secured funding from the Economic and Social Research Council to develop this interest further and brought this funding with her to UEA. Her work here at UEA has honed her focus on mixing methods and measurements and the ethical implications of these. However, she's moved into a different phase of her career where she spends as much time advising and teaching as she does researching, recognized in the award of a Senior Fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. Laura's day job these days is head of the School of International Development here at UEA, or as we fondly call it, DEV. Although I've only been at UEA myself for 3 months, it's already obvious to me that Laura is putting her expertise in understanding our social world through integrating qualitative and quantitative tools to good use. I've greatly enjoyed working with Laura, and I'm learning the benefits myself of seeing in an academic school through the eyes of an anthropologist. Laura is both an inspiring leader in her field and a collegial and a very human colleague to work with. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Laura Camfield to give her inaugural lecture.
So thanks, Frances, for that generous introduction. And welcome to everyone here and online. Thanks for indulging me on my favourite topic. The research I describe has all been collaborative, and although I can't mention everyone by name, I hope they know that I couldn't have done it without them. I'd also like to thank my partner and my family for their support and forbearance while I prepared this talk, and hopefully it will be even more stimulating than Peppa Pig. I think development researchers are comfortable with the question, why does research matter in development? Without it, how can people who work in development understand the places in which they're working and the profound effects of the changes they're proposing? How can they know whether installing a water pump has had positive or negative effects and for whom? Moreover, how can they respond to environmental and economic changes and act in ways that support rather than impede people's own actions? However, not all research and development is equal. By this, I mean it's not equal in status, and I'll return to this later. And more importantly, it's not equal in quality. My PhD research was an ethnographic analysis of the development of a measure of quality of life for people living with dystonia, a neurological condition that produces uncontrollable muscle spasms. I used ethnographic methods, which means that I worked alongside neurologists, I volunteered for the Dystonia Support Organisation, I talked to people with dystonia at events and in their homes, and I took a job as a health psychologist, developing a measure of the quality of life of people with dystonia. As I was in the anthropology department at Goldsmiths in London, then a hotbed of radical and transgressive thinking, any sense that it was normal to use measurement techniques from psychology to generate a number that represented people's quality of life was repeatedly challenged. What was quality of life, I was asked? Could you measure it? And why would you want to? Being asked to justify what I was doing at a conceptual, practical and ethical level meant that I couldn't take anything for granted. Through the process of developing the measure, I quickly established that these measures didn't work very well and that this was widely acknowledged. The task of the PhD was to understand the mix of structural and individual factors that led to their adoption in spite of this. For example, the way that the need for recognition from people living with and treating dystonia came together with the desire of drugs companies to generate a market for new treatments and demonstrate their effectiveness. International development is also full of what Brendan Whitty has called sausage numbers. These are numbers that may not be valid because they bring together many other numbers, some of which are wrong, but are still influential. For example, measures of GDP or gross domestic product show the extent to which economies are growing or shrinking. However, the work of the economic historian Morton Jervin has shown that these figures are based on little data and dubious assumptions. This is why a technical change to how the Nigerian GDP was calculated in 2014 doubled the size of its economy and ranked it higher than South Africa. The task of the critical development researcher is to skin the sausage, to understand what these numbers or powerful stories are capturing. In order to do this, we need to pay attention to methodology, or the way in which we find things out. Joel Best's hilarious book Stat Spotting gives the example of how in 2006, the US Secretary of the Interior released a report claiming an increase in North America's wetlands. This was the first time this had happened since the service began compiling data in 1954. After criticism from conservationists, he admitted that the gain was solely due to the adoption of a more generous definition of wetlands. It included man-made water bodies such as, of course, water hazards. Swamps, marshes and other natural wetlands had actually declined. This is a useful example when we think about what poverty statistics do and don't capture. For example, by definition, household surveys, where an individual, usually male, answers questions about the people who live in their home, do not capture anyone living outside a household. This means that those at the greatest risk of poverty, recent migrants, young people living on the streets, are not included when governments or other bodies estimate how many poor people there are in a country. I recall that even as a child, I was encouraged to take a critical view of data. My father told me a story about how for many years it was thought that eating the brown bits in potatoes made people ill. Wow, I thought, another reason to avoid vegetables. However, he explained that it wasn't the brown bits themselves that caused the problem. It was that the people who were so poor that they had to eat every part of the potato also experienced worse health as a result of their poverty. I didn't know then that this was a classic example of mistaking correlation for causation. My colleague Lucio Esposito flags this as one of the most common mistakes in evaluation in the first lecture of our introductory postgraduate methods course, Research Techniques and Analysis. Some people see a statistical relationship, for example, between dog ownership and communism. This is a real example, by the way. And they think that the relationship is real and that one causes the other. I also didn't know until I met one of them in my mid-20s that there's a whole profession of people called epidemiologists whose main aim in life is to demolish other people's causal claims. At least, that's how my new colleague explained it to me as we looked at the statistical relationship between measures of clinical function, for example, how severely their muscles spasm, and the quality of life of people with dystonia. Working with medical statisticians and psychologists earlier in my career, alongside training as an anthropologist, gave me an appreciation of the rich tradition of critical quantitative research. It also made me somewhat sceptical of authoritative numbers or stylised facts. Here in the UK, there's been a recent backlash against experts, leading to useful information that could have informed decision-making being ignored. How liberating, some people said, to be able to choose our own facts, our own realities. No need for government policy to be informed by the best data we have on how things work, what policymakers call evidence-based policy. Here comes policy-based evidence, where politicians cherry-pick the information that best supports what they were going to do anyway. In this context, it can feel as though there's no space to discuss methodological questions or appeal to common methodological standards. And yet we must recognise that the ways in which data are generated and analysed will produce particular conclusions. And this is easier to see in other people's methodologies than your own. I recently surveyed multiple guidelines for establishing the validity or credibility of research, whether, on balance, something is likely to be true given the way the research was carried out. Many of these guidelines looked at the particular challenges of mixed methods, which I'll describe later. Few of them looked at the way in which analysis shapes results. And this is also true in analyses of published papers. Maren Duvendak, I see her in the audience, which is great. Will Monteith and I had the amazing opportunity to conduct a review of all the development research jointly funded by ESRC and DFID between 2006 and 2014. And I'll make further references to this review later, as it provides a unique snapshot of development research in the UK. Our analyses found that fewer than 1 in 5 qualitative papers described how they did their analysis. To labour the sausage metaphor, it seems that even if we know the ingredients, we're not allowed to see the recipe. This is why I feel it's worth us spending time talking about methodology. In this lecture, I want to share some of the things I've learned from doing research, and in particular doing research that mixes qualitative and quantitative methods and understandings. By this I mean research that uses words and numbers, but also acknowledges that people who primarily do research involving words and those who prefer numbers might also have different ideas about what it means to know something. Along with mixing disciplines, for example, anthropology and economics, mixed methods is something that's difficult to do well and is rarely done wholeheartedly. But I hope to convince you that it's worth the effort. I'll do this by drawing on my own experience and more recently on experience of shaping others' projects as supervisor, editor, reviewer and evaluator. But first, another story. My first research post after my undergraduate degree was with the Aga Khan Rural Support Programme in northern Pakistan in the 1990s. I can see peers smiling with recognition looking at this landscape. It's quite iconic. I joined the monitoring and evaluation department, which assessed whether projects were working or not, as they were trying to work out how to use the participatory approaches heavily promoted by donors. These involve new methods such as mapping villages or communities and collectively ranking households according to how wealthy they were, using understandings of wealth that came from the people doing the ranking. I was keen to use these methods to investigate how AKRSP projects had affected the prosperity of people in the region. My translator and I set off on an exhaustive and exhausting programme of individual interviews and group discussions. After another well-dressed household had told us how poor they were, and I'd dutifully written this down, my translator said that in his opinion all qualitative research was gupshup or gossip. If we really wanted to understand how wealthy they were, we should count their apricot trees. This view of qualitative research is surprisingly prevalent. But the threats to the credibility of qualitative research, that people may not be honest, that the way they answer is shaped by the questions that they ask, and that they answer strategically are common to all forms of research, and by extension to all human interaction. The critique of quantitative research made by qualitative researchers is that quantitative researchers don't spend enough time thinking about how questions are being understood and responded to. Some quantitative researchers echo this. For example, Lerner urged researchers to take the con out of econometrics. The reason why this doesn't happen is that researchers assume that with large numbers or sophisticated analysis, errors will be cancelled out rather than multiplied. I don't have time to discuss this here. However, the growing practice of replication, where quantitative development researchers attempt to reproduce or replicate the results of influential analyses, has increased our understanding of the many ways in which errors can and do occur. Two colleagues in particular, Richard Palmer-Jones and Maren Duvendak, have been tireless in highlighting these. To give you a well-known example, a reduction in deaths among young children whose households were participating in the Millennium Villages project was used to justify continued funding. However, when the economist Gabriel de Maboynes put these results in the context of earlier demographic and health survey data, he was able to show that the project was overstating its contribution to an overall trend. Or to put it bluntly, the project was claiming results that would have happened anyway. This example shows that dodgy data and analyses have real-world consequences. MVP households were estimated to have had nearly $12,000 spent on them, although that was largely due to the administration costs, and all subsequent evaluations suggest this money could have been better spent. People who are interested in methodology and concerned about how to make it better are often interested in the potential of mixing methods. Quantitative methods tend to strip out context and obscure individual experiences. Qualitative methods are gupshup unless their findings can be reproduced in a large sample. Surely mixed methods offer the best of both worlds. Their potential is outlined by the influential mixed methods researcher Denscombe in the quote on the screen, where he highlights their potential to improve the accuracy of data and compensate specific strengths and weaknesses associated with particular methods. Branham boils these benefits down to elaborating on existing findings, sparking new research questions, complementing existing methods by expanding their focus, and exposing contradictions between the findings generated by different methods. In the next part of the lecture, I'll talk about how I've mixed methods. I'll then present a couple of examples from the large ESRC DFID review I mentioned earlier, and use these to highlight the potential and the challenges of adopting mixed methods approaches. I can honestly say that for as long as I've been doing research, I've always mixed methods. Not to do so would feel as though I were only looking through one eye. My initial interest, as I've said, was in how quantitative methods represent the world. When you develop a measure to capture the experiences of people with a stigmatizing neurological condition, what can be included and what is excluded? How do the people who respond to this measure understand it? And how does this vary across cultures? Sonia Hunt, who developed the Nottingham Health Profile, which was one of the earliest quality of life measures, describes how when they tried to translate it into Arabic, most of the questionnaire items were regarded by our Egyptian samples as variously irrelevant, sacrilegious, obscene, or laughable. There are some examples on the screen. However, I'm also interested in how the meaning of this data changes again as it moves from a journal in clinical neurology to a drugs company flyer for a new treatment for dystonia. The fallibility of measurement and methodology more broadly has been an interest throughout my career. Where individual measures are particularly weak is in capturing social experiences such as shame. And this is why one of the examples I present later looks at how this can be done with mixed methods. Measuring people's experiences clearly change these experiences, and in understanding why this happens, much of my research is focused on how people respond to these measures. In research with South African entrepreneurs, I used cognitive debriefing, where you ask people what they're thinking about when they answer a question. Just as an aside, this gentleman had launched his own travel agency, which he's tremendously proud of. It had been very successful in doing tours of Soweto. Cognitive debriefing, where you ask people what they're thinking about when they answer a question. This isn't an easy method to use, as it requires respondents to be articulate and able to reflect on why they gave the answers they did. However, their answers can be revealing. They can also highlight the problems that less educated respondents might have in answering the question. Even a relatively simple question, such as how do you decide whether you're successful, can have multiple interpretations. Glenn illustrates this in the quote on the screen, where he says, "Success is a big word." His answer depends on whether he interprets it as complete in every aspect of life or travelling towards that state of completeness. Similar problems arise when asking people about their family or their household without clarifying who they're thinking about when they respond. Misunderstandings also arise where the question reflects the values of the person who developed it rather than those of the person responding to it. In this example, the question seems to make sense. However, Matthie's response points to a more profound problem about where people locate agency in collectivist societies, where changing things in your life takes other people as well. This problem has been observed in research in South Africa using personality measures developed in the global north. Even where the same constructs exist, for example, pride, they're valued very differently. I give these examples taken from international psychological measures to show that quantitative data of this sort needs to be interpreted with caution. Here, mixed methods highlights the fragility of the data we work with. Returning to the theme of shame, Kitty Rowland and I looked at the extent to which children's understandings of poverty elicited through participatory methods could be mapped to a quantitative data set to produce an emic measure of poverty. That is, a measure of poverty that resonates with the people who are experiencing it because it's developed from their own understandings of what poverty is. These were examples of some of the group-based methods we used with children to generate this data. The aim was to reduce power dynamics, although it still looks a little bit like being at school, and generate fuller responses than would have been possible in a one-to-one interview. This is an example of a well-being exercise in Ethiopia. I think you can probably see that the boys' understandings of a good life are on the left and then a bad life are on the right. For example, obviously the data is not in a sense in the picture, but it was actually the very rich discussions after with the boy about his understandings of poverty. For example, living alone in an empty house with a leaky roof, as opposed to being part of a family and having a table laden with food. When we attempted to map these understandings to quantitative data already collected by Young Lives, we found this was surprisingly difficult. The quantitative data on clothing, whether households could afford to buy school uniform, failed to capture the dimensions that children were interested in, as these related to social inclusion or fitting in. For example, in one village in Ethiopia, children described how young, poor boys would go to school without trousers with something weird on top. Similarly, their indicator for food was not just frequency of meals, but how varied and delicious they were. For example, children in an urban community described a rich child as one who doesn't eat more than one kind of food more than once a day. Here, mixing methods highlighted a discrepancy between what poverty measures capture and what matters to poor children. They also reinforce the message from my example of quality of life measurement that measures are particularly bad at capturing the social aspects of any phenomenon. Our understanding of poverty within international development is poorer as a result. Here, I've used the data generated through a wellbeing exercise to make a methodological point that the household survey methods on which most indicators are based can't capture fundamental experiences such as shame. However, the starting point in my PhD research and subsequently has been wellbeing itself and the questions this provokes for policymakers and practitioners. What really matters to people? What makes them well? What gives their life quality? It wasn't always obvious that I'd be an academic. At university, where I spent most of my time in the office of the student newspaper, my tutors would have found it difficult to imagine me standing here. I still find it difficult myself. However, my location in international development and poverty research, and more recently adaptation to environmental change, is not surprising. I've always wanted to understand how people find meaning in difficult situations. When you have a chronic neurological condition, when you've been sentenced to 15 years for drug smuggling in another country, when you've lost the herd of cattle you spent your life building and now have nothing but fences. In that situation, how do you keep going? These two themes of what matters to people and how do we know runs through all my research. They're perhaps most obvious in the work I did with the Wellbeing in Developing Countries Research Group in Bath University, immediately after my PhD. There, in addition to extensive theoretical debate led by colleagues such as Alistair McGregor and Sarah White, we used qualitative and quantitative methods to generate an understanding of wellbeing across 4 countries in the Global South. It's hard to understand now, 16 years later, when the notion of wellbeing is widely accepted, just how revolutionary this was. I can't claim credit for the thinking that produced this definition, as it reflected years of debate within the group. However, my understanding of the shortcomings of measures of quality of life meant that I could take the lead in shaping whether and how we measured well-being. The traction this approach gained came from parallel thinking within international development around multidimensional poverty. It's also hard to think back to 10 years ago when the Human Development Index, a measure that combines indicators of health, education and income, that's the one on the left-hand side of the screen, was the only way to capture the multifaceted nature of poverty. Now the Multidimensional Poverty Index is widely accepted. It's shifted policymakers' understanding of what poverty consists in. Even though the index developers have tempered their ambitions according to the data available, as I had to do in creating a measure using children's understandings of poverty. Through one of those bizarre coincidences that sometimes occur, I spent a summer running participatory theatre workshops in Croatian refugee camps with the developer of the Multidimensional Poverty Index, Sabina Alkire. This perhaps gave me the confidence to gate crash the round tables on the so-called missing dimensions of poverty, where the initial thinking around the measure occurred. I tell this story because alongside the methodological journey I've been recounting, I've developed a strong interest in research ethics. What struck me about this experience was that while participants were keen to expose all aspects of respondents' lives to research scrutiny through adding survey questions about violence within the family and illegal activities, there seemed to be little recognition that these questions might be upsetting or produce meaningless data. I recognise the dominance of the household survey in global measures of poverty because it generates the income and expenditure data that indicate whether households are above or below the magic $1.90 a day poverty threshold. However, this need not be our only tool. Qualitative researchers at the table argued powerfully that while these questions were important and their answers needed to inform policy, the best place to ask them was not in a household survey. The context of research doesn't just shape the answers that are given, but is fundamental in generating those answers in the first place. To take an example from research with young lives in Ethiopia, here I compared 3 sources of data on girls' education from the same study. Group discussions with girls in rural and urban Ethiopia, which generated normative trajectories for their lives. Individual interviews, which generated data on their individual aspirations. And longitudinal survey data, which captured their educational trajectories over time. Unsurprisingly, there was considerable divergence. And this drew my attention to the way that particular methods create space for particular kinds of stories. If I'd only had data from the group discussions, my policy recommendations might have been around the importance of changing social norms to reduce early marriage in rural Ethiopia and the need to empower girls to see education as part of their future. The story told by the individual interviews of girls aiming for high school or even university would have changed that completely. This high-flying generation needs secondary school stipends, and perhaps we should expand the public university system to cope with this unexpected demand. But looking at the reality of the same girls' trajectories over time using the longitudinal survey data brings home the very real barriers that they face to realising their aspirations, and in some cases the impossibility of their doing so. This is a useful corrective to my earlier optimism and points me towards more fundamental systemic needs such as healthcare and social protection, as well as addressing gender inequalities. Without this foundation, girls' educational aspirations will always be fragile. This example doesn't pit one form of data against another because they're all telling something of value. It shows how much more you can see by mixing methods and the potential consequences for policy of relying too much on one type of data. Oliver Bakewell gives a nice example of the problem of the partial view in this quote, where he describes the danger of drawing broader inferences from data collected in a very particular context. He uses the example of an assessment by an NGO focused on water and warns that if that data is then taken up in a review of the human rights situation, it may present a situation that is unrecognisable to the people concerned. As researchers on large international projects, we're often in a similar position. Even if we designed the research, trained the researchers, tested the tools and supervised the fieldwork, we weren't present in every interview or group discussion and don't always understand the dynamics. In one project I worked on in southern India, where there was no keyboard that could type the local language, audio recordings were hand-transcribed in Telugu, typed up in Hindi, and translated into English. The transcripts that emerged at the end of this process often looked very odd indeed. By this point, we were essentially analysing secondary data rather than primary data, as so many other actors have been involved in its production. For these reasons, concerns around the ethics of data reuse have been a recurring theme in my career, and I'll return to these later. Recognition of the ways in which context and people's agency in that context constitute data also shows the value of a mosaic approach. I developed this with colleagues in Young Lives and I'm currently using it in GAGE, which is a longitudinal study of the effectiveness of interventions such as girl clubs with young people in the Global South. Here we bring together multiple different forms of information about adolescents' lives, generated by many different methods and from many different sources. I reassured my partner that this was from many different sources, because when he first saw this slide, he thought it was sort of an example of child abuse, that one poor child was forced to participate in all these different forms of research. But yes. And this enables our analysis to set them in the widest possible context and understand how their lives change over time. By doing this, we avoid the unintentionally isolating effect of qualitative methods. In doing justice to individual experiences, the influence of parents, peers, local structures such as the school, policy regimes and global processes are sometimes obscured. In relation to children, this is often represented through the circular diagram of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. What I like about this slide is the way in which the different layers interact and shape the experience of the individual child who's placed at the centre. Capturing this requires research across multiple scales. It's the combination of different forms of data and mixed methods approaches that offers that potential. In my role as reviewer, I've been fortunate to see many inspiring examples of mixed methods approaches, some from my own school. I'll now pull out a couple of examples from the review I mentioned earlier, which covers 122 projects funded by the ESRC-DFID Joint Scheme for Research on Poverty Alleviation. The first captures the potential of mixed methods and interdisciplinary working in addressing topics such as shame and social exclusion. The second brings together anthropologists and economists to rework economic models of how households divide resources. What excites me about the Poverty and Shame study is its explicit focus on relationships as part of people's experience of poverty. It does this by linking the socio-political concepts of social exclusion or adverse incorporation, where people are excluded from society or included in unfavourable terms, with the psychosocial concept of shame. This brings the disciplines and fields of political science, psychology, development studies and social work into a creative dialogue. Secondly, it mixes primary and secondary data, giving it a longitudinal perspective. In Uganda, for example, an analysis of proverbs revealed that poverty had lost its association with misfortune and solidarity and become closely connected with individual culpability. This was supplemented by analysis of other literary forms, films, school textbooks, to demonstrate that the problem wasn't confined to a single genre. They also looked at interview and focus group data across generations to see whether these changes at the level of discourse were shaping the way that non-poor people thought about poor people and poor people thought about themselves. Thirdly, it drew on analytical expertise in the participating countries by getting local literary scholars to create and analyse the data set. And finally, it engaged children as well as adults in discussing poverty and solicited the views of the non-poor, who are rarely included in studies of poverty. Now, the sharp-eyed among you will say, yes, there are lots of methods here and they're working well together, but where is the quantitative component? The quantitative component came in the way that they used computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software to analyse the literary texts and in some cases transform them into numerical data sets, for example, by counting the number of times that key phrases occurred. This is an example of a hybrid approach that challenges the binary thinking underpinning mixed methods and has great potential if managed carefully. A few weeks ago, one of my seminar groups suggested that soon impact evaluators could be replaced by bots, but I don't think even DFID cost-saving measures go quite that far. The second example of mixed methods, which draws out some of the challenges, is a study of cooperation between household members in India, Nigeria and Ethiopia. This was done by economists and anthropologists using experimental games, a survey and life history interviews. Economists and anthropologists are often presented as on opposite sides of a methodological divide, so this was a valuable opportunity to work together and gain a deeper understanding of each other's methods. Experimental games where, for example, people are given a sum of money and asked to divide it between the other players are often criticised unfairly, of course, for being unethical or bearing little resemblance to real-life situations. The credibility of these methods can only be enhanced by having an ethnographer ask questions that enrich economists' understandings of what participants are thinking as they play the games and how the results relate to everyday experiences of cooperation between the spouses. This could have been an example of mixed methods at its best, or at least its most ambitious. However, reflecting on the process, the principal investigator identified three main problems. I think this will be familiar to anyone who's managed a research project. Firstly, the scale of the project and the size of the team meant that the majority of their time was taken up by data collection, management and administration, reducing the time for analysis and writing. Secondly, there were delays in finding the right partner in one country where the research infrastructure was less developed. Difficulties working with the partner who was eventually selected delayed field work further. And finally, despite the potential for mixed methods, none of the papers produced by the project combined experimental and qualitative data. This is worth exploring further. One reason was lack of time, which made it more efficient for team members to draw on the data they were most comfortable with in writing the papers. However, the main reason was the contrasting cultures of co-authorship in economics and anthropology. While it's common for economics papers to be co-authored by multiple researchers, single-authored publications are valued more highly in anthropology, so collaboration could incur a reputational cost. This shows how socio-cultural factors can be as important as material ones in determining the success of mixed method studies. It's valuable because frank reflection on what went wrong is unusual in development research, which the development researcher Martin Prowse attributes to an airbrushing of dead ends and false starts during writing up. When we think about the challenges to doing high-quality mixed methods research, two questions to keep asking ourselves are firstly, whether these challenges are specific to research using mixed methods or arise from the combination of different methods with their own particular problems. Secondly, whether the benefits outweigh the costs. In an edited volume with Keity Rowland, we group these challenges under credibility, complexity, and usability. In relation to the first, credibility, academics studying phenomena from a single disciplinary perspective, such as economics, often see research that mixed methods as less credible. This might be true to what Martin Hammersley calls paradigm wars, which can also be seen in the debate between experimentalists and others with an impact evaluation. It might also be due to more practical concerns around ensuring quality, given that few people are experts in both qualitative and quantitative methods. I feel excited to meet early career researchers who are committed to mixed methods, but also nervous as I know this will expose them to criticism from multiple audiences rather than just one, that they might find it harder to publish in prestigious journals, and that their work may not be valued by appointments and promotions panels. The second aspect is complexity. The recognition that, for example, pathways out of poverty don't go in a straight line should play to the strengths of mixed methods approaches. For example, Peter Davis asked 293 participants in a longitudinal study in Bangladesh to tell him their life stories. He used this information to show that when people moved in and out of poverty, fewer than 1 in 6 of these movements were smooth. I also found this in work with Kitty Rowland that explored Ethiopian households' movements in and out of poverty. However, despite the influence of complexity thinking on development discourse, and by that I mean the way that people talk and write about development rather than what they actually do, many studies treat livelihood systems as though they had clear lines around them and poverty dynamics as though they were linear processes. Mixed method studies themselves can be unhelpfully complex where multiple methods are used without a clear rationale. In these cases, analysis falls back on data from conventional methods such as surveys and interviews. This was true in 85% of the mixed method studies we looked at in the ESRC DFID review. The conclusion that we drew from this was that by the point of analysis, most mixed method studies were not very mixed at all. The fact that only 5% of outputs from these projects reported both qualitative and quantitative data raises questions about the genuineness of mixing. In fact, discussions at this point with a colleague doing a similar review on gender led to her publishing a paper entitled "It's Gender, Jim, but Not As We Know It," reflecting a shared feeling that by the end of this process, little was left of the original vision. This is something I watch out for in reviewing PhD proposals, as I want to be sure that students understand what each method is doing and how it will work together with its fellows. I also want to see that they've thought through how they'll integrate this data and analysis, as this is something I still struggle with. The final aspect, usability, relates to the way in which policymakers engage with mixed methods. Despite their promise, many prefer quantitative methods, which are characterised as more rigorous. The language of rigour justifies a bias towards experimental and quasi-experimental approaches reflected in the hierarchies of systematic reviews and the evidence guidelines of influential donors. In these, we see randomised control trials where participants are divided into treatment groups who receive, for example, a cash transfer, and control groups who don't, at the top of the hierarchy, and qualitative research at the bottom. Many colleagues in Dev work on systematic reviews, where papers are selected according to their relevance to a particular question and then filtered by their quality using widely accepted scales. In areas such as poverty and child protection, where there's little quantitative data, I've quality assured a review that started with thousands of papers and ended up with about 7. This led us to conclude that the way we assess quality isn't always fit for purpose. I've given you a good sense of the issues that have excited me during my career, and particularly the potential and challenges of mixed methods. There's much more I can say about prevailing trends in development research, and I've recently used this data in a chapter commissioned by the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes for a forthcoming volume on the future of development studies. But rather than discuss that here, I want to return in the final part of the lecture to a theme I flagged earlier as being particularly important to me, that of research ethics. My understanding of ethical research extends beyond research that doesn't exploit or distress participants. I think we can take the importance of that as given. I also care about whether researchers understand and communicate the limitations of what they're doing, whether they're prepared to share their data and provide the support needed to use it effectively, the sorts of partnerships they engage in, and how work is distributed within teams. Returning to the sausage metaphor presented earlier, even if on paper a study meets all the appropriate ethical standards, unless I know that the data was treated well throughout its life, and this was also true of the people who generated, processed and analysed it, I'm not going to want to consume it. This brings us to one of the biggest questions within development studies research, which is how we avoid reproducing colonial practices of resource extraction and exploitative labour relations in the way that we do our research. This involves thinking about our practice in multiple different dimensions. For example, whether we build relationships over time and these people then become trusted collaborators on grants, or whether we body shop them in at the last minute to satisfy funder expectations. Whether we work with partners to develop our research approach and theoretical framework, and or expect them to administer something that we've developed. Whether we welcome comments relating to theory and the assumptions underlying the research design, or whether we assume that the only valuable input our partners will give relates to logistics. Whether we acknowledge the embedded knowledge that's lost when we don't generate the data ourselves, or involve those who did in the analysis. And finally, whether partners have time in the budget to engage in the more prestigious activities of communicating research, including through high-impact journal papers. Our analysis of the ESRC DFID data found that while all the projects involved Southern collaborators, their research projects didn't always have Southern authorship. One principal investigator had first authorship on 24 papers. Authorship also varied across type of output. In addition to being more likely to have authored less prestigious outputs, such as reports or papers in regional journals, published Southern authors were more likely to have written quantitative papers than ones using qualitative or mixed methods. The underrepresentation of Southern authors is indicative of a wider problem. Sarah Cummins and Paul Hoybink's analysis of international development journal articles in 2017 found only 14% of authors were from the Global South, and we found 14.6%. Funding policies that require northern institutions to act as auditors and reduce staff costs where possible also inhibit the, the development of genuine partnerships. Moving from partnerships back to methodological transparency, for me, a big part of this is having access to the data that researchers use to create their analysis. For qualitative researchers, it can be time-consuming to prepare data to a standard where it can be put in an archive, including ensuring that there's nothing in it that could identify or embarrass the participants. This task often falls on colleagues in the Global South or more junior researchers in the UK team, reinforcing the inequalities mentioned earlier. In relation to the ESRC DFID projects, while more than half of them reported that they'd archived their data, only a fifth of them had actually done so. Only 2 of the mixed methods projects archived both qualitative and quantitative material, and only 1 of the qualitative projects archived transcripts of the original interviews rather than summaries of the data. Quantitative projects rarely archived raw data and code, which show exactly how they did their analyses, making it harder to replicate their findings. The quality of study documentation was variable. Some projects archived their data with no information at all about how it had been generated or processed, reducing its utility for secondary analysis. Having access to the original data isn't necessarily about evaluating its quality. Data can be a valuable teaching tool, bringing home the messiness of fieldwork. It can also enable people to set their research in a broader context. How frustrating to read an essay, PhD proposal, or even article that begins by claiming that no research has ever been done on the topic that the person plans to address. A chemistry professor and friend at Bristol University has an email footer saying, 6 months in the lab will always save you 1 hour's work in the library. This reminds us of the importance as researchers of doing our homework. Conversely, how wonderful to find a rich archive of data in the area you plan to work, or a national data set that will enable you to set your findings into context. In the ESRC DFID analysis I've referred to previously, half the projects in the UK sample focused on a single country and often a single site. However, studies with a tight geographical focus could still use a location, such as the Tirupati Garments Cluster, which makes clothing for export, to travel up the value chain from Indian workers to buyers in European countries. The use of multiple scales within the same project or paper, which is a key benefit of mixed methods, was enabled by an increasing use of secondary data alongside primary. This was even true in qualitative studies, where over a third of projects used it to set their data in a broader context. And obviously, I feel this is an extremely encouraging development. One of the main messages of this lecture is the need for greater critical reflection around the way that we conduct our research. Despite the importance of criticality to development researchers, the analysis I've undertaken of UK research projects and outputs shows limited critical reflection, even in response to specific questions in reporting to the funder. Less than a fifth of the outputs I looked at mentioned limitations, and only 30% provided information on ethics. The explanation may be the increasingly competitive environment for research funding and the attention of policymakers. Rose Wiles and colleagues' study of innovative research practice for the National Centre for Research Methods in 2010 noted that few authors in our sample identified failures. The characteristics I've discussed in this lecture provide a helpful snapshot of the current state of development research. For example, the pressure from funders to take conclusions beyond what the data will support, especially in evaluation, the lack of funded time for reflection on the research process, or to conduct research that's not problem-focused. Of course, these challenges are not particular to development research, and organisations such as the Development Studies Association are increasingly working with sister organisations, such as the Social Policy Association, to look at how they're addressed in the Global North. This is particularly helpful in relation to research ethics. Recent experiences of doing research in Great Yarmouth reminded me that people aren't always as polite to researchers as they are in Kenya. But this, of course, leads us to think of the very different power dynamics in these settings, which come up frequently in discussion with impact evaluation students. A recognition of these is critical to is central to critical social science. But this feels threatened in a context where one of the main development research funders is channeling its research through a framework that reframes research as consultancy and opens it up to the private sector. While the cuts in staffing at DFID and the research councils might look like efficiency, they've led to the outsourcing of research commissioning to the holders of large centre grants who fund colleagues to produce more of the same, reducing the space to innovate. As I reflect on the state of development research, there are three things that I'd like to see more of. Firstly, equal partnerships with collaborators in the Global South, where funded time is provided to co-develop the research approach and write prestigious outputs. I write this recognising that this is not the direction in which development research is headed. For example, one colleague submitting a grant to the Global Challenges Research Fund was told that they'd allocated too much time for Southern partners, and as a result, it wasn't clear how it would strengthen UK research capacity. Yeah, some people will be looking horrified, others will be thinking, gosh, I better make a note of that for my next application. It's a topsy-turvy world where our funders assume that we have nothing to learn from our collaborators and where overseas development aid becomes a way of plugging gaps in higher education funding in the UK rather than strengthening equivalent systems worldwide. My second wish is for clear methodological accounts so that data users understand how the data was generated and any potential limitations to the analysis. Every data set should come with a health warning and should ideally be accessible to consumers of data as well as other researchers through training and comprehensive guidance on how to use it. Of course, this has ethical as well as resource implications, and I say this as someone who has worked with colleagues to explain the concept of an archive to Peruvian school children. Finally, I'd like to see greater recognition that doing good mixed methods research, indeed doing any form of research, requires time, patience and openness to aspects not anticipated in the grant proposal or theory of change. In the funding context that I described earlier, this really would be to do different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That's really quite remarkable to be able to take gossip, sausages, and truly understanding global poverty into one lecture, which captivated everybody's attention here. I think we have time for one or two questions for Laura.
Yes, I might have overdone it a bit with the sausages.
Do we have one or two questions? Questioner, gentleman there.
Sort of response you get from DFID staff, particularly those in geographic places who control the money. This sort of wide-ranging from your lecture meetings, sort of discussion about methodologies required and how to evaluate. What sort of response do you get from civil servants?
Well, I think that's a good point to make, because you're correct that civil servants don't tend to have a great deal of patience for this, this sort of methodological debate. I think it was Lyndon Johnson who said sort of impatiently to some analyst, ranges are for cattle, give me numbers. They don't want to hear about the complexity of the situation and how difficult it is to understand it. They want some actionable policy recommendations. And people do tend to also grasp for heuristics in their understandings of what research is credible and not, as I described earlier. I mean, what I've tended to do in a number of projects, and this is also true of the one which DFID is funding, Gauge, is to sort of smuggle in more participatory, more open-ended elements around a solid core of quantitative research. In Young Lives, it was the longitudinal survey. Engage, it's the fact that we're doing a series of randomised controlled trials, suddenly lose the ability to speak, and some quasi-experimental approaches. But then alongside that, we've got longitudinal qualitative research, and we're also doing some research that enables older adolescents to tell their own stories through media and other participatory methods. This resonates with some DFID staff. I have to say probably more DFID staff based in the UK than in countries, but it means that we potentially have something to offer everyone. I mean, what we're focusing on particularly is not coming up with recommendations that are trite and that have been heard before, but you're really having a strong understanding of the sorts of recommendations that are normally made on these topics, and also the barriers to them actually being put in practice. I mean, it's obviously not in, you know, when DFID is spending, sort of giving us 9 years of funding, to go back to them and say, oh, lots of problems in the education system, I think it needs a bit more money, is clearly not going to cut the mustard. So we're trying to be as precise and focused as possible. And particularly, you know, you can draw, when you're working on a project covering multiple countries, you can draw some interesting lessons sort of globally and for international research funding, but in country, what governments want to know, what DFID staffers want to know is what can practically be done here. So that's very much our focus. I don't know if that quite answered your question. You've possibly forgotten what your question was by the time I got to the...
Do we have any other questions? One there.
If you were to have, a couple of hours, half that, with Sir David Attenborough, given his particular emphasis on climate change and on population matters, what do you think the outcome might be insofar as you would take from the discussion some future work?
I think I could certainly learn a lot from him about the importance of science communication. I mean, how to really communicate with the general public, because obviously that's something that he does tremendously effectively. I'm not sure that I'm properly, you very kindly warned me this question was coming, so I should have had time to Google it. But I'm not sure I'm that au fait with what his particular perspective is. But obviously, I think anyone in development recognises that environmental change is one of the biggest threats to all development efforts. So, I mean, in that sense, I sense that we're on the same page. I think there's also been historically, a lack of recognition within development of the importance of strategies relating to conservation, and perhaps a broader understanding of environment. So it's not just sort of focused on how people use it, but also understanding the intrinsic value of the environment as well. So, I mean, in that sense, I think we'd have quite a lot to talk about. But, I mean, when you train as a qualitative researcher, it's quite difficult to take that opportunity to kind of give your sort of lift pitch. Your temptation instead is just to sit him down and get him to tell you his life story. So I think that would probably be my focus, to understand as much as possible about what he felt about these issues, rather than necessarily to try and put across my own perspective, which could be a missed opportunity. But hopefully I'd get him to come and give a seminar at UEA so we could all ask him a bit more.
Time moves on, so sorry for the other questions. So the expression was gup shop?
Yes.
Gup shop. So
new word we've all learnt today.
Some people regard it as a success. You mentioned success to own the word in the mind of the reader. And I've looked at your talk, and I'm afraid you don't count, because gup shop gossip is not you. What you actually have done brilliantly is exactly the opposite. So sorry if you hope to own the word, but that's not possible here, because you're too good. I think development is one of the big subjects of our time. It's been caught up in all sorts of political debates, which has confused people, which is a real shame. But what you do is actually take it beyond political debate into reality. And I think we all agree that society is still full of individuals who want to do the right thing. And you help people to understand what is the right thing to actually achieve success in helping other people all around the world to do better. And that's a really, really important thing. So it's wonderful that you are here. It's wonderful. Thank you for all being here. So friends, colleagues, and family, and there's lots of family here, bursting with pride. And as a university, we are equally bursting with pride for you and for being part of our university, and for all the work you're doing, because it's really making a huge impact to a lot of people around the world. So thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Perhaps you'd now like to join Laura for a little drink outside. Would that be okay?
That sounds great.
Thank you very much. One final round of applause for Laura.
Yes.